We gave them moral support. We recognized them. Bukovsky came to the State Department and to the White House, and we received him. They were coming and speaking truth to American audiences. Zhenitsyn was one of them. He came here and he gave speeches in different places and he wrote books that were published. We should thank the French for helping to make him intellectually respectable, because they received his books in France and they took them seriously, whereas many American scholars who are of an anti-communist bent didn't want to listen to things like this. But when the French intelligentsia listened to it, it had an influential effect here in the United States, and people took Solzhenitsyn seriously. And Solzhenitsyn was also an absolutely brilliant writer. His artful use of language and the power of his narratives had a tremendous effect. Another great dissident who appeared in the United States was Vladimir Bukovsky. Bukovsky was a student of psychology who had been a dissident inside the Soviet Union. He spent a third of his life in the Gulag archipelago. He was not only subjected to imprisonment and slave labor, but because he was such a persistent advocate of his own rights, and he learned how to use Soviet law to make the Soviet bureaucracy pay attention to his complaints. It's a very, very interesting methodology. He was looked upon finally as such a troublemaker that he was sent to the Serbsky Institute of Forensic Psychiatry in Moscow, which was one of those so-called psychiatric clinics where they were giving the inmates, and I call them inmates, not patients, because it was a psychiatric prison which had high walls in the back with concertina or barbed wire on top of those walls to keep people penned in. And they were giving people psychotropic drugs in order to do a sort of chemical lobotomies of their brains. And they were using these drugs to erode and destroy these dissidents' will to resist. So Bukovsky was the first dissident received by an American president in the Oval Office. He came out as part of a prisoner exchange, and President Carter, to give him credit, received Bukovsky in the Oval Office. But Bukovsky then started lecturing, writing. He wrote a brilliant book, he wrote brilliant articles, and he worked with us in the Reagan administration. We gave them moral support. We recognized them. Bukovsky came to the State Department and to the White House, and we received him. Well, you know, are people like, are Chinese dissidents being received in the White House? Are they? Maybe they should be. Maybe if they are, they will be given prominence. Their voices will be magnified. More people will hear about them and hear their message. This is something that I strongly recommend. Some of them were somewhat afraid. However, during the Cold War, dissidents from the Soviet Union were much more secure within the borders of the United States than Chinese dissidents are now, because we severely restricted the travel of Soviet officials in this country. For example, Soviet diplomats stationed here in Washington, D.C. were restricted to a 25-mile radius and could not travel beyond that without special permission from the State Department. Similarly, the Soviet diplomats at the United Nations in New York were restricted. The Soviets had consulates in a couple of cities around the country, but not everywhere. Bukovsky has set up and worked with others to set up a group called Resistance International, which I think was originally, I think it may have had a French, l'Internationale de la Résistance, I think is what it was called. And this was the collection of the various anti-communist and human rights movements throughout the world. Central America, Southern Africa, Afghanistan, East Central Europe, and within the different Union republics of the Soviet Union. There may have been a Chinese branch of it, for all I know. I didn't work intimately with it, but I would suspect that the US government must have given some support to this group. We would have our dissidents appear on broadcasts over Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the Voice of America. And of course, some people may have been dissidents who had come out of those lands. Others may have been, may have come out and at an earlier period, but were obviously dissidents, but they may have come out of an earlier immigration and wanted to try to help reclaim their country's freedom.